One of my favorite agents I've built with Mastra is called Beacon. Beacon helps me with my analytics across Google Analytics, PostHog, YouTube Studio, and my newsletter. I find myself mostly interacting with Beacon in Slack, which is probably my favorite place to work with agents. Let's take a look at an example of how I use Beacon, working through Slack. So here's a look at me asking Emma how my traffic looked week over the past month. So this was back in June. And back then, Beacon was a separate agent who I delegated through Emma, but now is also available in Slack directly. And so we can see a report back that week over week traffic over the past 4 weeks and a bunch of stats. And that's not necessarily the interesting part. What is interesting though is if you look here, we can see that it noted a driving surge. So it saw that Slash services went from 45 page views to 302, becoming the #1 page, likely tied to a paid campaign that appeared this week. And that was actually true. So I highlighted and mentioned back to Emma that yes, that's correct. I did try to do some paid Google ads, but didn't seem to get any conversions. And so from there, Emma did a little bit more of a deep dive. And we found that yes, if noticed that the Google Analytics campaign, campaign 1, drove 174 sessions and 154 users to the site just that last week. And all were landing on services. It did notice a problem though, that there were 0 form submissions, 0 bookings, 0 email captures from the paid traffic. But it's noting that visitors did not ignore the page entirely. So something was wrong with my conversion tracking. And so it goes through and highlights all the potential signals and what the results were. And what's interesting here, though, further is that, Emma and Beacon are also connected to the code base itself, to my website. So they can actually take the learnings from the analytics and look at the code base and actually understand how it's built, what pieces are there, and potentially highlight or flag what problems there are. So altogether a cohesive system. So this is a great example of how powerful the agent is, but the biggest flaw is that I had to initiate this conversation myself in Slack. So if I hadn't actually asked for this report, I wouldn't have actually gotten any of these insights pulled up for me to actually know what to look into or what problems there might be. So I went ahead and set out to automate this. Now every Monday, Beacon automatically runs this prompt and compares the analytics of my website from the previous week. It also maintains a cohesive memory of what I've been working on my website, such as ad processes or things like that. Today, I'm going to walk you through how to schedule agents using Mastra. By the end of this video, you'll understand the different types of scheduling functions that exist, when you might use one over the other, and we'll walk through some code on how I actually put this together with Beacon. If you're new to the channel, my name is Damian Galarza. I've been a software engineer for over 15 years. During that time, I've grown teams from 0 to 50, shipped FDA-cleared software as a medical device, and now I focus my time on applied AI and building agentic systems. This week's video is brought to you by Mastra. Mastra is the TypeScript framework for building AI applications and agents. If you want to learn more, I'll leave links in the description below. Everything you'll see today is built using Mastra. Now, let's dive in. So Mastra provides a few different ways to be able to actually schedule different things, prompts, agents, things like that inside of its ecosystem. So there's about 2 kind of core different ways. One, there's what's called just scheduling inside of Mastra, and that's where you can actually take any agent and schedule a prompt through them to run. And so at that point, the model or the agent does the whole entire job. So the cron fires, a prompt is going to be sent to the agent, and it's going to do its job and things like that. And so in that case, if we were to use Beacon in this example, we'd say give it some tools like the get website analytics snapshot, and then another tool for maybe posting to Slack, which is going to be a mutation. The other version is through scheduled workflows. So if you're not familiar with workflows, I've done another video on that and I'll link to it above. But workflows are a way to have multi-step processes to encapsulate different workflows and things like that inside of Mastra and with agents. You might have multiple types of agents, multiple LLM calls, things like that, and you can orchestrate them together. And so you can actually put those on a schedule as well. So that has built-in scheduling. And so in this model, you might have step 1 where the Beacon calls the LLM call to do its research on how to get the analytics snapshot, and then pass that to step 2, where we then might take that and post it to Slack. And that's actually the model that I went into. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit. So here's an example of scheduling with Mastra for an agent. So you can see here that the Mastra API just has mastra.schedules.create, and you give it the agent ID. So that's the ID that the agent has. So in this case will be Beacon. And then you can give it a cron syntax for how often you want this to run. So anything that cron supports, you can pass in there as well. And there are also some aliases that you can use too. And again, that's all documented in the docs, and I'll link to those. And then you give it the prompt. Prompt, prepare weekly website performance report is an example. And so there's two options. You can do threadless, which is this case where there's no thread ID, meaning there's not going to be any kind of memory in between each run. And when you call await.mastra schedules create, that's persisting it into a database. So you do need some kind of storage layer that's available for creating this schedule. And from there, the issue in my mind here is the delivery piece. So my agent Beacon doesn't actually have a tool to send messages to Slack. It's connected to Slack typically through the Mastra Channels interface, and that doesn't expose a direct tool for the agent to just write to Slack. It's more about responding to messages coming into it and subscribing to a thread. And so the other version here is using the same scheduling API, but using a threaded version. And so what this means is we've passed it on lines 5 and 6, a thread ID and a resource ID. And so everything else is the same, but here it will actually have some continuity between the calls. So anything that happens can be persistent in Mastra's memory system and will be on that thread ID and that resource ID. So basically every time this schedule runs, it's accumulating that history over time on each call. So same kind of system, but now it just has this persistent memory system across the different runs. So you can see on the left, there's the threaded side. So it has a thread ID and a resource ID. And so week 1, it has that same thread. Week 2, it goes back and it has both the history or the context from week 1 and 2. And again, week 3 is now going to have the context from weeks 1 through 3. So that context is building over time as every time that it runs, versus the threadless version, which you might use if you just have a report that you just want fired off, but doesn't need any context of prior runs. Here, it's just a fresh run, no history every single time. And so I ended up going the threaded route with a stable thread. So I run a weekly performance thread, and the resource is the website. So that way, everything that I do around this always accumulates into the website. So that way Beacon has a single kind of thread or history of everything that we talk about or work on that's related to my website. The things that we exclude from this are the actual numbers. So we don't actually want Beacon to kind of like make a report based off numbers that it remembered from the previous run. We just want it to have kind of like stable facts about our conversations. And we're leveraging the Mastra memory system to do all of this. When you have these schedules, you can also go ahead and do things like pause them, run them, or resume them. So you have an API to be able to do all of this. And like I mentioned before, you call it, and you don't want to necessarily call create more than once because you'll get an error that says that it already exists. So it's really a one-time operation to kind of seed that into the database and avoid calling it in the future. So now let's take a look at scheduling a workflow. So here's an example of the code for doing that. So again, if you're familiar, it's calling create workflow as usual. And there's a new schedule argument that you can pass into the options for constructing it. And schedule, similar syntax, has a cron field, a time zone, and input data. So input data is anything you want to pass it every time it runs to that schedule. And then everything else is the same. So right, we have the then call that calls generate report and then deliver to Slack. So in this version, we only have one model step. So this is the version I went with Beacon. The cron schedule is going to fire, and it's going to call step 1, which is going to be the agent to generate the snapshot of the analytics and build its report. And then step 2 is going to then go ahead and actually deliver that. So that's going to interact with Mastra Channels to find the right channel and post that to Slack for me. In between each of those calls, we do have a contract to check and verify that we got back the report that we expected and that it looks correct before we actually send that to Slack. So we have a gate in between to make sure that everything looks right. So now let's jump into the code that we have for Emma and Beacon to take a look at it in actual progress. So on line 147, we have the weekly website performance report workflow. Again, it looks similar to what I showed you in the slide. We're calling create workflow. We have a stable ID. We have an input schema, an output schema, and a schedule. Step 1, generate the weekly performance report. Step 2 is going to be deliver the weekly website performance report. So that's where it's going to send it via Slack. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first piece, which is the calling of the report. So we can see here that we have a piece where we are actually getting the date for us. So when this gets called, we're going to actually get the current date and determine the range. We're not going to let the model figure out what date it is. We're actually going to provide it to it to make sure that it's stable and correct, because sometimes the model can hallucinate what the current date is or things like that, and you run into issues like that. So instead, we're going to use deterministic code as part of the step to identify what the current date is and then what the range is. That's what the completed report ranges function does. So that's just going to get a range from Monday through Friday based off the current date, or at least the last 7 days. And then it's going to get the channel ID. So I'm injecting the channel ID in the environment via the .env file. And so that has the channel that I want to be able to deliver the Slack message to. So we're extracting that. And we're instantiating our request context. And that's necessary to go ahead and make the website memory scope. The next step we do is we go ahead and grab that agent. So because we're in the workflow, we call await mastra.getAgent beacon, so the ID of the agent, and grab it and pass it in our prompt. And so our prompt is basically just being built via a function, taking that fire that time to generate and understand what the ranges are for the request. So here we call and get the await master.getAgent to grab beacon, and we call generate on that agent with our prompt. And our prompt gets built using fire.that to understand what the range is for it. And then we have our prepare step, some request context, and then the memory definition. So here's where we customize the memory for this specific call that we're making to this LLM. And so in this case, we have our resource, website resource ID for the resource, the weekly report memory thread ID. So we're giving it a dedicated thread for this weekly report so that it can use, and then some options. It's read only. The last message is false, semantic recall is false, and observational memory is false. So we're not using those features of the memory system as we go through here. So here's the step that actually takes that report, does a sanitization check for it, then uses Mastra Channels by getting the agent and getting channels off of that. So Beacon is configured itself with Mastra Channels. We initialize the channels with Mastra, and then we go ahead and call channel for Slack, and we have the input data.channel ID that was passed in from the previous step, and it was extracted out of the environment, and then we post the report to it. And then we return delivered as true as well. So all of this comes together to be able to let us schedule our prompt and run that report. Now, if we go into Mastra Studio, we can go into workflows and we can see our weekly website performance report. We can see that it has 2 steps. We can click schedules and see that here it is registered and is active, and that the next fire is going to be in 5 days. Last run is never because it's been cleaned up and refactored a few times. And then here's the time for when it runs. We can go into the schedule itself and see the trigger history. So here was me kind of testing out this schedule for myself over time and how long it's taken and things like that. And so you can always see the history of all of the runs that it's been going through inside of Mastra Studio, as well as all of the things that you have scheduled. You can even go ahead and click pause here to pause this so that the next time it doesn't run. And so even if you restart your session, your agent, your Mastra instance, it will go ahead and remain paused for you. I'm going to go ahead and resume so that it comes back up. Of course, you can go into the workflows itself and see we have 2 steps like we saw in code, where one is to generate the weekly performance and the other is to deliver the weekly performance. And so that's everything we have. So right there, we have the ability to take our agents and easily schedule them to make our agents even more useful to us as they do work. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I make weekly videos on content just like this, which is building with AI or as well as agentic development. And if you are interested in the code snippets on how I did this, I will link to a blog post below where I cover everything I covered inside this video in a little bit more detail, including code snippets for everything here. And of course, all of the documentation will be linked below in case you want to dive into it yourself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.